Thanks very much for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this wonderful celebration of the life and career of Norman Borlaug. I knew Norm a little bit from time that we spent together serving on the board of Winrock International, which was then headed by Bob Havener, a former DG at CIMMYT. As sitting around the board table, I had a chance to observe Norm's communication style up close, and it was a unique style. It used to be said that there are three different kinds of communication. There's dialogue, and there's monologue, and then there's an extreme form of monologue known as Borlaug. When I think Ronnie Cummings gave a pretty good imitation the other day. The fist pounded the table, the voice elevated, the words came fast and furious. The room would shrink back into an appreciative, respectful silence. It was quite a show, but nobody backed up his words better than Norm. So for me, it was a treat to have a chance to get to know him. It was mentioned in the introduction that Norm co-authored a foreword to one of my books. It was interesting. When I asked him if he'd be willing to co-author the foreword, he said, "Well, yes, if you'll allow me to do it with President Jimmy Carter." I said, "Wow, what could be better than that, to have two Nobel Peace Prize winners co-authoring the foreword to my book?" But it did get better for me because the first Amazon site for the book identified me as the winner of 2 Nobel Peace Prizes. I told my students that winning the first Nobel Peace Prize isn't that hard. It's getting the second one that's particularly difficult. So I have happy and grateful personal memories of Norm Borlaug, but I know he would be displeased with what I have to report today. I was asked for this meeting to offer some thoughts on the future of agriculture biotechnology, and the evidence I see is that when it comes to staple food crops, at least, including wheat, also rice, also potato, also white maize, the near-term future is not particularly bright. Because when it comes to food crops, the gene revolution, in contrast to the green revolution, hasn't yet reached farmers' fields. And for someone like Norm, whose mantra was "take it to the farmers," this would be the most galling outcome of all. A valuable, usable technology that's been developed by science that is now being blocked from reaching farmers' fields. So I'm going to frame my presentation by asking why were the food crops of the Green Revolution so widely and quickly adopted while the food crops from the GMO revolution have scarcely been adopted at all. Now, as you know, there's been substantial uptake of some GMO crops, but mostly crops grown for animal feed, including yellow maize and soy, or for industrial purposes, particularly BT cotton. Scientists have also moved valuable GMO traits into wheat, into rice, into potato, into tropical white maize. But the efforts that have been made and into many other food crops, but the efforts that have been made so far to bring these crops into a commercial space where they can be used by actual farmers have been largely frustrated. And just to remind you of the substantial blockage that GMO food crops have faced until now, it's been almost 2 decades since the GMO revolution was launched, but still no commercial planting of GMO rice in any country, no commercial planting of GMO wheat in any country, no commercial planting of GMO potato in any country, tropical, well, not tropical really, but white maize in the Republic of South Africa only, no tropical white maize being planted anywhere commercially. GMO sugar beet, only in 2 countries, as far as I know, the United States and Canada. GMO fruits, well, really, the only one out there is papaya, and just in 2 countries, the United States and China. Vegetables, in the United States, some summer squash and some sweet corn, but otherwise practically nothing. Just recently, just the end of last year, Bangladesh finally went ahead with BT brinjal, BT eggplant, but that's the beginning. That's not the completion of a breakthrough here. And as for GMO animals for food or GMO fish, nothing anywhere has been commercialized. So what explains this? This is a very different pattern from what we saw when the modern varieties of the Green Revolution were released. Very quickly they spread to dozens of different countries, and eventually the modern varieties covered 82% of all cropland in Asia. Why, in the case of GMO food crops, which were first brought forward in the 1990s, 2 decades ago, how come there hasn't been a wider uptake? And I'm going to look quickly at several possible explanations. I'm going to ask, are GMOs less safe than the Green Revolution varieties? Are restrictive intellectual property claims blocking their uptake? Are GMOs more difficult for farmers to use compared to the Green Revolution varieties? Are food needs less urgent today? Is that why we're not using this new technology? Or is it possibly higher regulatory barriers for GMO varieties compared to the Green Revolution varieties? I study government. I'm a political scientist, so as you can imagine, I'm probably going to focus in on the last of these explanations, which I think is the most critical. But first, just to set aside the first possible explanation that GMOs might somehow be less safe, it might have been understandable in 1994, when these crops were first commercialized, to be uncertain about their safety. Not every hypothetical risk had yet been tested for. They were a novel technology, but that was 20 years ago. And by the early 2000s, all of these most prestigious science academies in Europe and globally had said in writing, we find no convincing evidence of any new risks to human health or the environment from any of the genetically engineered crops that have been placed on the market so far. Really a spectacular, clean bill of health from the most prestigious science academies in the world. And more recently, in 2010, an even more conclusive statement came from the European Union Commission, saying main conclusion to be drawn from efforts of more than 130 research projects covering more than 25 years, more than 500 independent research, it's not corporate research, independent research groups, that biotechnology, in particular GMOs, are not per se more risky than, for example, conventional plant breeding technologies. This is from the European Union Commission. So if GMOs are perceived as more risky today, it has to be traced to something other than factual evidence. What about restrictive intellectual property claims? This is a second possibility. Maybe this is what's been slowing the uptake of GMO food crops. This was indeed an early fear. Initially, the expectation was that developing countries would be desperate to get their hands on this valuable, productive new technology, but they might be frustrated because the technology was being developed by private companies or universities, sometimes with intellectual property claims attached. Maybe developing countries wouldn't be able to get access to these intellectual property protected technologies. But that's not what happened in the end. Most developing countries are not desperate to get their hands on these technologies. They have been told that these technologies are dangerous, and they have to carefully protect themselves from the damage that these technologies can do to human health and to the environment. So the expectation that they would want them and we might hold them back is completely reversed by reality. Second, this hypothesis doesn't make sense because the private companies haven't held the technology back. Private companies have been more than willing to license their patents on a royalty-free basis for use in poor countries where there really isn't much of a commercial seed market anyway, like Africa. This has been done for a number of food crops, none of which has ever been commercialized. But third, you have to remember the reality. When it comes to patent claims, a patent claim that's registered in the United States or in Canada has no legal standing in developing countries that don't allow patents on seeds. It's simply impossible for companies in rich countries to extend any legal reach into the territory of poor countries that don't want to recognize seeds on patents. So technology moves around. Farmers move patented seeds from Argentina into Brazil. They pirate technologies, and they get BT cotton into India their own way. It's the thought that because these technologies are patent protected in rich countries, they can't make it to poor countries is not convincing to me. So a third possible explanation are GMO technologies harder for small farmers in poor countries to take up? And once again, the answer is no. It was actually the early Green Revolution technologies that presented a significant challenge because they only performed well if used in combination with fertilizers and pesticides, and many poor peasant farmers didn't have much experience using these chemicals. When it comes to GMO technologies, the first generation of GMO technologies actually should have been easier for farmers to use because you could protect against pests without chemical pesticides or with fewer chemical pesticides, or you could protect against weeds with an easier system that lowered labor costs. It was less managerially demanding. So these technologies are not more difficult for small farmers to take up. And we know from the few exceptional cases where farmers in developing countries have been given permission by government regulators to plant GMO crops that indeed they are taken up as quickly or more quickly than the Green Revolution crops were. I've shown here a number of examples. Cotton in India, BT cotton, first legal to plant in 2002. 10 years later, 88% of cotton in India was GMO. Soybean in Brazil, first legal to plant in 2003. 8 years later, 83% GMO. Cotton in Burkina, in only 3 years' time, 58% GMO. Philippines, yellow maize, in only 8 years' time, 64% GMO. Republic of South Africa, white maize, in 11 years, 72% GMO. And in China, in just 5 years, papaya, 99% now GMO. So I dismiss the notion that these crops are more difficult for small farmers to use than the Green Revolution crops. But now we have to ask, maybe GMO foods are not being taken up because food consumption needs in the developing world are less urgent today than they were in the 1960s or the 1970s when the initial Green Revolution varieties became available. And these data from the World Health Organization do show that the prevalence of underweight children back in, this data starts in 1980, the numbers were even higher in the 1970s. Prevalence of underweight children was in fact much higher during the early Green Revolution era than it was in the 1990s or today in the GMO era, particularly and obviously in Asia where the Green Revolution took off. Of course, there are still far too many undernourished children in Asia and elsewhere. And these data show that in Africa, the prevalence of undernutrition scarcely declined at all over this period. But notice that at no time has undernutrition in Africa even been close to the level that Asia was experiencing at the time the Green Revolution seeds first became available. Norm Borlaug was able to get the attention of political leaders in Asia, in South Asia, in the 1960s, because the leaders of those countries feared famine. They didn't know for sure that population growth was going to begin to slow down. They didn't have a plan for what to do if food needs continued to increase. And the rest of the world was fearful of this as well. I remember a book titled Famine 1975, which predicted that India wasn't even worth trying to save. We should stop giving food aid to India. It will only keep people alive to have still more children, to make the calamity, when it finally occurs, that much more devastating. And these books were read and discussed by serious people. The 1960s, particularly in Asia, was quite a different time from the 1990s when GMO food crops came along. Of course, the famine never happened because of the success of the Green Revolution itself. But the elimination of these famine fears, plus much lower food prices on international grain markets after the 1970s, led to another fateful change. Following the dramatic success of the Green Revolution in Asia, donor commitments to agricultural development in poor countries were scaled back sharply. The donor community simply pulled out. Between 1980 and 2005, the share of World Bank lending that went to agricultural development fell from 30% down to just 6%. The president of the World Bank in 2005, Paul Wolfowitz, said, my organization's pretty much gotten out of agriculture. Between 1980 and 2003, the real dollar value of all bilateral assistance to agricultural development fell by 94%. And even assistance to Africa, where population was doubling and the prevalence of hunger was not declining, dropped. In fact, the United States, the U.S. Agency for International Development, reduced its agricultural development assistance to Africa between 1980 and 2006, reduced its assistance by 86%. So this was critical because the original Green Revolution had been promoted by the donor community, by trusted public sector institutions, donor governments working through agricultural ministries, through public sector extension agencies, and local NGOs. The new seeds were distributed at cost or for nothing. They weren't being sold by multinational corporations. But when the donor governments abandoned the task of agricultural development assistance in the 1970s, or after the 1970s, they left too much of the burden of presenting GMOs to the developing world to the private sector, to private profit-making corporations. Now, the fact that the GMO revolution was being promoted by private companies rather than by trusted public sector institutions then led to another unfortunate change. This is kind of a cascading series of glacial changes. It triggered a global campaign by anti-corporate activists to block this new technology that they saw as a sinister plot by multinational corporations to gain control of the third world. But I actually blame the donor governments for this. If you walk off the field, if you leave the action just to private companies and their adversaries in the NGO community, you're going to get the kind of titanic clash that we've seen ever since. Now, and this is the biggest difference between the Gene Revolution and the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution didn't encounter strong resistance from rich countries. It encountered resistance from inside poor countries, inside India. The finance ministry was skeptical. They didn't want to invest any money in agricultural development. They wanted industry, likewise the Planning Commission. No one wanted to spend foreign exchange to import fertilizer. The Communist Party didn't like the idea. But those barriers were overcome, in part through the Borlaug technique. What's different about the Gene Revolution is that now resistance is coming from the outside, and specifically from rich countries. Powerful political actors and institutions in rich countries have decided that they don't want poor countries to get this technology. First, let's admit it. Consumers in rich countries don't like GMOs. Now, I don't think it's because they see a risk. I think instead it's because they haven't yet seen for them a personal benefit. GMOs don't taste any better, look any better, smell any better. They're not any more nutritious. the first generation of GMOs weren't intended to deliver direct benefits to consumers. They were intended to deliver direct benefits to farmers. And in rich countries, farmers are now, in Europe, maybe 4% of the population. In the United States, less than 2% of the population. This is a technology that was easy for consumers in rich countries to dislike. But it was mostly environmental activists who turned consumers in rich countries against GMOs. And this is another major difference between the Green Revolution era and the Gene Revolution era. The original Green Revolution wasn't blocked by organized environmental groups in rich countries, because in the mid-1960s, there weren't any organized environmental groups in rich countries. The United States didn't create an environmental protection agency until 1970. Greenpeace wasn't founded until 1972. As late as 1978, inside India, there weren't any strong organized environmental groups. Vandana Shiva in 1978 was still studying quantum mechanics. So the organized resistance from environmental groups that's blocked GMOs wasn't a factor when the Green Revolution came along. Now, it's true that after the global environmental movement coalesced in the 1970s and the 1980s, they came out strong against the Green Revolution because they didn't like the fertilizers, the pesticides. They didn't like the water use. They didn't like all of these things that went along with the new seeds. But by then, the seeds were already in the hands of farmers who weren't about to give them up. But by the time GMOs came along in the 1990s, the international environmental movement was much stronger. In fact, it's proved strong enough to keep this technology out of the hands of farmers. Last year, Mark Linus, an environmental activist campaigner who's now had a change of heart about GMOs, described the NGO campaign against GMOs as the most successful campaign that he's ever been a part of. And I think there's evidence to support that. As for the methods used by environmental activists from rich countries to block access to GMOs, it was partly done, unfortunately, through the United Nations system, which had also changed by the 1990s compared to the 1960s. After the 1970s, the UN system opened its doors to wider participation by NGOs. They were there at every meeting. They had contact offices in all the agencies. And by the 1990s, activist NGOs, mostly from Europe, such as Greenpeace and Friends of the Earth International, both from Amsterdam, in partnership with environmental ministries, largely from Europe, had virtually colonized, if I dare use that word, the environmental sector of the UN system. They had pushed for the creation of the United Nations Environmental Program, UNEP, in 1970, and then with that 72, and then with that agency in place, they pressed for the negotiation of a new international treaty on GMOs, the Cartagena Protocol on biosafety. And this is Nairobi in the year 2000, when the Cartagena Protocol was coming into effect. This is at UNEP headquarters. The European environmental activists had used their influence over the negotiation of this protocol to reframe the GMO issue as an environmental threat, a threat of genetic contamination to the developing countries and to the rich biodiversity of the developing countries. They even modeled the Cartagena Protocol on the 1986 Basel Convention on the transboundary movement of hazardous wastes. Now, it takes a lot of nerve to reframe a valuable agricultural technology as though it were a hazardous waste, but they did it, and they got away with it. Under the terms of the Cartagena Protocol, all of the developing countries would henceforward be expected to keep GMO seeds out of their country until they had set in place a stringent set of formal regulations, modeled, of course, after the regulatory system that was being set in place in Europe. And the regulatory system in Europe, remember, has kept GMO seeds out of farmers' fields in Europe for the most part since it was completed in 1998. Here's a quick summary of the regulatory requirements that GMO crops now must meet in most developing countries. None of these requirements were imposed, of course, on the Green Revolution varieties in the 1960s. They're not even being imposed today on the biofortified varieties being developed by Harvest Plus, simply because they're not GMO. These are regulations that are specific to this enemy technology, genetic engineering. In order to approve GMOs in developing countries, first, your national parliament has to enact a new law, a biosafety law. Then you have to promulgate new regulations under that law. Then you have to set up an interagency, multi-stakeholder National Biosafety Committee. Then that committee has to review on a case-by-case basis every application to do research with GMOs, to bring GMOs into the country, let alone to release GMOs into the environment. And they don't have to say yes or no. They can simply sit on the application forever until the applicant gets tired. When they make their decision, they're encouraged to follow the precautionary approach, which will allow them to block an approval, even in the absence of any evidence of risk. All they need is simply uncertainty. And of course, you can get uncertainty by hypothesizing a risk that hasn't yet been tested for, or you can, and there's always the nth hypothetical risk, and there's always the nth year of exposure to the nth hypothetical risk. So this process can go on forever. The extreme version of the precautionary principle is never do anything for the first time. And that is, in effect, where many developing countries are stuck with GMOs. If India in 1965 had used the precautionary approach, the Green Revolution would have been stillborn. And finally, even after a GMO is approved, even after it's approved, developing countries are now setting in place requirements for mandatory labeling, for market segregation and tracing, for coexistence so you don't contaminate organically grown crops, and strict liability so that a technology provider can follow the law, follow the best practices, and if anything accidental happens, the provider is legally liable. If you want to kill investment in a new technology in a developing country, there's no better way than to make the technology providers legally liable when, in fact, they tried to do everything right. Now, I recall some supporters of GMOs naively went along with this regulatory scheme, thinking that if it was strict enough, it would reassure those who were skittish about the technology. But in fact, it only tended to reinforce anxieties. When people saw these regulations going into place, they concluded this must be a really dangerous technology if you have to impose these kinds of regulations on it. But the problem now is that with these formally legislated restrictions on GMOs in place, how do you pull back? Even if public opinion changes, even if the economic environment changes, how do you relax these regulations? It takes an act of Parliament to reverse an act of Parliament. And we've seen on several occasions how difficult it is once you're trapped in this mindset to relax regulations. In 2002 in southern Africa, a severe drought devastated the maize crop. 15 million people were at risk of famine and needed food aid. And the food aid started coming in. Much of it was yellow maize from the United States, delivered through the United Nations World Food Program. The yellow maize was GMO. But NGOs noticed that this was in violation of the Cartagena Protocol because the yellow maize was coming in without labels. It had to be labeled GMO under the Cartagena Protocol. And so they persuaded the government of Zambia to refuse the food aid and even to insist that the World Food Program remove from the country the food aid that hadn't yet been distributed, but it was already in country. Asked the World Food Program to conduct a reverse operation of taking food aid out of a country on the brink of a serious food emergency. In one instance, in a market town where the local people learned what was about to happen, they overpowered a guard and broke into a warehouse and took the food before their government could take it back away from them. Another example of the irreversibility of these new stifling regulations on GMOs came in the wake of the 2008 world food crisis. Following that crisis, regulations on GMOs were not relaxed. Governments didn't say, maybe we should invest a little more in productivity and rethink our attitude toward GMOs. Even in Africa, half a dozen countries in West Africa and on the Horn of Africa experienced street demonstrations and protests over suddenly higher food prices. But to the present day, none of these governments has taken an additional step forward in approving GMO foods. None has relaxed its regulations on GMO food crops or released food crops to farmers. In fact, currently, in all of the countries of East and West Africa, in only one of those countries, Burkina Faso, is it yet legal for farmers to plant any GMO crops, and in Burkina it's just cotton, an industrial crop. Oh, it's true that in a number of other sub-Saharan African countries, research on GMOs is underway, including food crops like maize and cassava and banana. But I'm a little skeptical because African governments have, I think, found a convenient way for them to steer between political risks. They keep their scientists happy by letting them do greenhouse trials, confined field trials, especially if the donor community is willing to pay for it. But they use their national biosafety committees to block commercial release. They've embraced a de facto research-only posture. What this does is it sort of it neuters the scientific community. They don't protest because they're getting their money to do the research. And if they're out of the picture, the political coalition to push GMOs toward commercialization actually gets weakened. So finally, to my task here of predicting the future, my best guess about the future of GMOs, I see that the posture we're in today is one that might continue. It can continue, I'm guessing, maybe for as many as the next 5 years. And this posture is one that looks at GMO crops depending upon their use. For industrial crops like cotton, I expect the planting of GMOs will, like BT cotton, will continue to spread, and perhaps even in Africa. One country today, Burkina, in North Africa, Sudan, in the Republic of South Africa, cotton. It could maybe go to Ghana or to Uganda or Kenya, but that's an industrial crop, not a food crop. For livestock feed crops, like soy and yellow maize, once again, I think the production of these GMO varieties will continue to spread. It's heavily in the Western Hemisphere right now, but who knows? China might go ahead with BT maize soon as an import substitution strategy. But this is yellow maize for livestock. The key food staple crops, including wheat, rice, and potato, and white maize, here I'm afraid there's a good chance that these will continue to be held back from farmers. And with every added year of non-commercialization, new research investments in GMO food crops will wither, and that might tend to lock in the present condition of very little progress. Now, if there's anyone out there with a genuine interest in social justice, someone like Norman Borlaug, it should be pretty obvious what's going on here. The rich are getting what they want from GMOs while denying to the poor what they need. That's what's going on. In today's rich countries, almost all future demand growth won't be for food staple crops. It'll be for feed crops and for industrial crops. This outcome won't block the use of GMO animal feed or industrial crops, so the rich will be happy. Farmers in rich countries, particularly in North America, who grow maize and soy for animal feed or for industrial purposes, if it's corn for ethanol, they'll be happy too. They can keep doing what they're doing. But in poor countries, where population is still increasing and where food demands haven't yet been adequately satisfied, and where staple foods are what most farmers plant and grow, this outcome is a calamity. Poor farmers in Africa and South Asia don't plant a lot of animal feeds. They rely on food crops, and if food crops are cut out of this next generation of progress in agricultural technology, they'll be cut out as well. So under my predicted near-term future, both consumers and farmers in rich countries will get what they want from GMOs, but food staple production and consumption needs in poor countries will continue to be denied. And this is the kind of outcome that Norman Borlaug would not be able to tolerate. So what can be done about it? And here I don't have a lot of hopeful answers, but my prescription would come from my diagnosis. Here's my diagnosis, that the difference between the Green Revolution era and the GMO era. The Green Revolution went ahead because hunger fears were acute, trusted institutions were in control, and there wasn't any opposition from international NGOs, particularly international environmental NGOs. The GMO era, we've not seen food crops go ahead because all these conditions are exactly the opposite. So what can we change? Well, I don't think we want to go back to an era of acute hunger fears, so let's not change the first one of these factors. As for the third factor, I don't think we can eliminate the networks of non-governmental organizations that now campaign for environmental protection and social justice and against corporate-led globalization. They are there, and they're going to be influential. We may not be able to change that, but I think we can change the middle row here. We can put public sector institutions back onto the playing field. If donor governments, for example, the United States government through USAID, were to make much larger investments in research activities, for example, at places like CIMMYT, on transgenic varieties, and that research is mostly withered. If the public sector were to fund this and insist upon it, you would be putting this technology back out on the market through not just private companies, but through public sector institutions, and that would, I think, strengthen its chances of acceptance. So let me stop there, and thank you very much.